One of the things I find most terrifying in true crime cases is when the culprit is someone close to the victim that no one ever suspected. The unassuming next-door neighbor, the family friend who always came to the block parties, the father who had a loving family. It's bone-chilling to imagine that someone you love and trust could be capable of heinous crimes like murder. Many true crime fanatics might be familiar with this case that happened all the way back in 1999, but is still captivating people to this day. In today's episode, we cover the murder of Alita Diane Ray, the victim of an extremely jealous and possessive ex-wife. My name is Lucy, and you're watching Killer Bites. Meet Vernon Jensen. Back in 1991, he was a 20-year-old recently separated bachelor. He worked in a hospital in Boise, Idaho as a student studying respiratory therapy. That's where he met Vicki Jensen, a registered nurse at the same hospital. Like any new blossoming relationship goes, they flirted, worked long shifts together, and got to know one another. Vernon shared that he was in the process of separating from his wife and that he had 2 kids. Vicki was also a divorcee, and she had a 4-year-old son. Vernon liked Vicki. He thought she was friendly and charming. And she liked him, but maybe a little too much. Vernon admits that from the very beginning, he wasn't looking for a serious relationship. Sure, he enjoyed spending time with Vicki, but he was in the middle of a divorce and trying to figure his life out. So they went on a couple casual dates. Things were going well. That was until he went on a weekend trip with some friends and returned to discover Vicki had been looking for him. And I'm not talking about a couple text messages or a few voicemails. It's even more extreme. She called his mother and asked where he was. Vernon was a little weirded out. I mean, how did she even get his mom's phone number? Well, apparently, Vicki went into the phone book and just went down the list of people with the same name Jensen and just started cold calling. This is a red flag if I've ever heard of one. But it doesn't stop there. Vicki also told Vernon's mom that she was his girlfriend, even though they hadn't agreed that they were defining their relationship in those terms. When Vernon talked to Vicki about it, he said he didn't think they were girlfriend-boyfriend. They're just testing the waters, right? Figuring things out. But Vicki simply brushed him off and insisted that, yes, she was his girlfriend and he was her boyfriend, end of discussion. That's another red flag. You might be asking yourself, why didn't Vernon just end things then and there? Well, I guess it was still early in the relationship and he told himself that she was just really into him. So he wanted to give her another chance. They continued seeing each other now as girlfriend and boyfriend, I guess. Vernon poured himself into his work and a few months later it paid off. He secured a full-time position at a hospital in a nearby town, Twin Falls. As happy as he was, Vicki was less so. She accused him of leaving her and moving to Twin Falls because he was seeing someone else. Even when Vernon told her that wasn't the case, Vicki decided to remedy the problem herself by moving with him. That's right, she just quit her job, moved cities, and moved in with him, wedging herself even more into his life. Around this time, Vernon's divorce was finalized with his first wife, and again, Vicki saw this as an opportunity. Vicki announced that they would get married, and that's exactly what they did. Again, you might be asking, why didn't he see this as a sign of danger, or at the very least that he was in a toxic relationship? As they spent more time together, Vernon saw the more possessive nature Nikki had. Since he had just gone through his first divorce, I think he felt a lot of shame for his previously failed marriage and wanted to make this new one work out. He had no idea, though, how far he would be pushed by Vicki's troubling behavior. Once he moved in with Vicki and her son, Vernon caught glimpses of a much more unsettling side of his new wife. He knew she could be possessive and prone to jealousy, but his concern grew when he noticed burn marks running up and down her son's legs. When he asked her about it, again, Vicki brushed them off and said that the burns came from an accident in the bathtub. She said she was giving him a bath when the phone rang, or was it the doorbell? She couldn't remember. She ran off to answer it, and while she was gone, her son accidentally turned on the hot water and burned himself. But Vernon wasn't having it. How long had she been gone that her son had enough time to turn the water so hot in such a short amount of time? And why did the marks appear to be so deliberately placed? There weren't any sources confirming whether or not Vicki ever abused her son, but from the way Vernon talked about living in her household, it sounds like she had volatile and violent parenting habits. Things continued to worsen from there. Vernon recalled a time when he was doing a home improvement project in their yard and came home with some fencing materials. Vicki came storming out of the house, berating him for getting the wrong type of material. It ended with her punching him in the face, all over some fence materials. Another time, Vicki was making sandwiches for lunch. She started putting roast beef on a sandwich for Vernon, and he politely told her that he didn't want any roast beef, which he had told her in the past. Still, she continued to buy it, so he thought, fine, she can eat the roast beef and I'll just eat something else. Seems like a reasonable compromise. But when he asked her for no roast beef, she deliberately left it on his sandwich and handed him the plate. He was a grown man, so he didn't yell or get mad or scream, he simply took off the roast beef. He got up to get another plate so he could set the roast beef aside, and while his back was turned, she picked up a knife and threw it at his head. Vernon soon realized he was in a relationship where he didn't get a say. He didn't get to have input in childcare, in what was for dinner, in what he even ate. And he soon found out he didn't even have a say in his own business of child support with his first wife. Once he'd become more established at work, Vernon got a letter in the mail stating that his child support payments had increased. When Vicky heard about this, she was beyond furious. She claimed that Vernon's ex-wife was trying to swindle them out of money and steal from them. Despite Vernon's protest that his first wife didn't have such ill intentions, Vicky was convinced she had to take matters into her own hands. Folks, this is when Vernon saw a truly undeniable sign that Vicky was capable of serious harm. Vicky started rambling on about the perfect way to murder someone. She said if a person were to inject someone with enough insulin, they would die and no one would suspect a thing. Especially, she said, if you injected it between their toes. That's a place police rarely check when analyzing a body. And she said that was exactly what they should do to Vernon's ex-wife. Of course, Vernon didn't take her seriously. I mean, did his wife really just threaten to kill his ex-wife? Not only did she threaten it, she spelled out exactly how she would do it and why she would get away with it. Vernon was freaked out and he hoped and prayed Vicky didn't act on her plans. One day, Vicky came home with vials of insulin and syringes. Vernon realized that she was seriously intending on carrying out her plan. He put a stop to it immediately. He grabbed the bottles of insulin and syringes from her and threw them away. He was about to go to the police when he realized he didn't really have hard evidence against Vicky. It would be his word against hers. He felt stuck. Around this time, Vernon was teaching classes at a nursing home and met one of the nurse's aides who worked there. Her name was Alita Diane Ray, but everyone called her Diane. Both Diane and Vernon were in bad relationships at the time, so she was a sympathetic friend for Vernon to talk to about his situation. She too had been through her own divorce and was in a toxic relationship with a boyfriend. She had kids from her first marriage, including a 3-year-old daughter named Jade. Vernon said talking to her helped him regain his sense of self-worth. She reminded him that it wasn't normal that he couldn't pick his own food to eat. It wasn't normal that his wife both physically and verbally abused him on a daily basis. So one day, Vernon finally took the leap. He packed up his stuff while Vicky was at work, got his own place, and filed for divorce. He started picking up more shifts to pay for a divorce attorney, but of course, Vicky didn't just let Vernon walk out. She continued to harass and threaten him. She hunted him down in the parking lot as he got off of work one day and demanded he return home. When he said no, she screamed that she'd never let them get a divorce. Vicky's harassment continued and Vernon started to worry about his own safety. He went out and bought a handgun to protect himself. Despite buying a gun, I don't think Vernon really wanted to cause any trouble. I don't even think he wished Vicky harm at this point. He just wanted to move on. Vernon tried to cut all ties with Vicky before he started seeing Diane. Diane had gotten out of her abusive relationship, and a couple months later, Vernon and her were engaged. Diane and Jade moved in with him. And you can bet once Vicky found out, she didn't like that at all. One day, Diane and Vernon heard a knock at their door. They answered it to find Vicky standing on their porch with Diane's abusive ex-boyfriend. Diane was frozen with fear. She had escaped her abuser only to have him show up again and now teamed up with her fiance's abuser. And of course, she'd heard stories from Vernon about how dangerous Vicky could be. Vernon called the police. He was afraid not only for his life, but more importantly, his girlfriends and her daughter. He witnessed what Vicky was capable of when she didn't get what she wanted. He knew what twisted and evil plans she made up in her mind to get her way. But because nothing had actually happened, the police said there was nothing they could do. So Vernon and Diane just had to keep their guard up and either pray that nothing ever happened or that if something did happen, it would be enough to warrant police involvement, but not bad enough to cause harm. That's no way to live, and Vernon wanted to have a happy life with his new family. Vernon and Diane made plans to move to a different state and start anew, but those plans never came to pass. On the morning of September 9th, 1999, Vernon left for work at 7 a.m. He was going to be back at the house around 11 to pick up Diane and Jade. They were going to join him on a business trip to Sun Valley, Idaho, since they didn't want to be alone in case Vicky showed up. But there was a knock at the door after he'd left for work, and when Diane answered it, she saw a scared 14-year-old girl. Her name was Autumn Pauls, and she said her boyfriend beat her up and she needed to use a phone to call for help. And who was with the teenage girl? Vicky. Immediately, Diane recognized her and tensed up, but she didn't see her ex-boyfriend with them, and if Vicky was here to make peace, Diane didn't want to accidentally start anything. So she let them in the house to use the phone. Once they were inside the house, she realized there was a third person with them, Autumn's boyfriend, Matthew W. Pearson. Diane realized they'd tricked her and she was in trouble. What if they hurt her, or worse, what if they hurt Jade, who was only 3 years old at the time? The trio held Diane at gunpoint and backed her into the bedroom. Autumn stayed outside with Jade in the living room to distract her. In the bedroom, Matt held Diane down while Vicky injected her with insulin, just like she had said she was going to do with Vernon's first wife. Then she injected Diane with to make it look like an overdose. But that's not even the worst of it. Over the next hour, the drug started to take effect and Diane weakened. She called out for Jade, trying to protect her even when she knew she wasn't going to make it. Jade walked in, and at only 3 years old, she had no idea what was going on, but she knew something wasn't right. Her mom was crying and telling her how much she loved her. Apparently, it was all happening too slow for Vicky's taste, so she put a pillow over Diane's face and finished the job. After Vicky had killed her, she planted syringes and more in Diane's purse to make it look like she had used it before. On their way out, Vicky even suggested they also kill Jade since she was a witness. Vicky had just heartlessly taken a woman's life, and she was already thinking about killing again, and this time a child. Thankfully, I guess you could say, Autumn and Matt weren't on board, and because of that, Jade was left alone with her dead mother. The phone rang. Jade answered it. It was Vernon. He was on his way home and he wants to speak to Diane. "Mommy's taking a nap," Jade said, "and she's wearing purple or blue lipstick." That was how Jade processed it. Not that her mom had passed away, was cruelly taken from this world, but that she was simply asleep and had some makeup on. It's heartbreaking that she had to go through that, and Vernon knew something was wrong. He rushed home, and when he got there, Jade was watching TV. He went to the bedroom and found Diane's body lying on the floor. She was already long gone. Like Jade had said, her lips were purplish blue. I wish I could say it was an open and closed case. I mean, based on what we saw, it seemed pretty straightforward that Vicky was responsible, but the police weren't convinced yet. They first believed Diane's death was natural. There were no signs of forced entry or any sort of scuffle between parties. There was also a huge abuse problem in Idaho in the 1990s. With the traces of they found in Diane's body, plus the paraphernalia they found in her purse, it seemed very plausible that she had just died of an overdose. The police asked friends and family, including Vernon and Diane's adopted sister Esther Kopnick, if Diane had ever used. They all said no. Esther was sure she would have known if her sister had been using. And Vernon also didn't think it was an overdose. Somehow he knew Vicky had something to do with this. He insisted. But as far as the police were concerned, he had no concrete proof. After Diane's death, Vicky continued to harass Vernon. As if it weren't bad enough that she murdered someone, she had the nerve to call Vernon on the phone and express fake surprise and sympathy that she'd heard Diane had passed. Vernon tried to distance himself from it all, get a fresh start as best as he could. Yet, Vicky would not stop tormenting him. She showed up on his doorstep, insisting that they talk things out. This time, Vernon was ready. He agreed to go for a drive with her and brought his gun just in case. But he said things felt different this time. Vicky seemed less volatile, but still cold-hearted, if not more. He said it seemed like the light had gone from her eyes. When she went into another speech about how they belonged together, he stood his ground and refused. Instead of putting up some kind of fight like he thought she would, she simply said, "Okay," and dropped him back off at his apartment. Vernon watched as she drove away. Jade, still only 3 years old, yet a key witness to the slaying of her mother, insisted that other people were at the house before Vernon got home. The footage of her talking to the detective after she learned the truth of what happened to Diane is chilling. You even see the investigator take a moment to collect himself as a 3-year-old Jade so matter-of-factly says that her mom is dead. Jade claimed that it was 3 men who were at the house, but we could later learn it was actually Vicky, Autumn, and Matt. The police didn't know how to sort through this 3-year-old's jumbled account of what happened, and they still couldn't find any evidence that suggested homicide. Vicky was brought in for questioning, but she wasn't budging. She claimed she had nothing to do with the death of Diane. And even when Vernon told authorities that Vicky had talked about murdering his first wife, Vicky wasn't the prime suspect. That was until they got a tip from someone who seemingly had no connection to the case. It was Autumn, the 14-year-old niece, who inadvertently got them caught. She was talking to a friend who wasn't getting along with her stepfather. That's when Autumn boasted about how she'd had a way of getting rid of people without getting in trouble. When the friend asked her what she meant, she told her about what they'd done to Diane. I'm not sure how much detail Autumn went into, but it was enough to spook her friend. So the friend contacted the police and told them Autumn had alluded to committing a murder. Once Autumn was brought in for questioning, she confessed almost immediately. She said she wasn't in the room when her Aunt Vicky and her now ex-boyfriend Matt injected Diane, but that she was out in the living room with Jade. Matt was also brought in for questioning, and he corroborated her story. He said he did it because he thought if he went through with it, he and Autumn would get back together. All that was left was to get Vicky's confession. At first, she continued to play dumb and refused to admit she had anything to do with Diane's murder. Once the detective revealed that he'd already gotten confessions from both Autumn and Matt that placed her at the scene of the crime, she finally caved. In February of 2000, 6 months after the murder, Vernon got a call from Esther. She said the police had made an arrest. Vicky was finally brought to justice. In court, the judge called Vicky an evil mastermind, saying that she was responsible for a perverse and horrendous crime. She was charged with first-degree murder. At age 39, she bargained with the prosecutors so that the death penalty was off the table. Instead, she was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Autumn and Matthew were also tried as adults later that year. Autumn received 12 years to life, while Matt was sentenced to 15 years to life. In 2001, Vernon and Vicky's divorce was finalized. Vernon remarried in 2017. As of 2022 prison records, Autumn was released on parole in 2015. Matthew remains in prison. And to this day, 24 years later, Vicky remains in prison too. Prosecutors and judges have called Alita Diane Ray's murder one of the most horrific murders in Twin Falls County. It was covered in a documentary series titled Evil Lives Here, which explores how people lived alongside sociopathic friends and family members who would go on to commit heinous crimes. As a true crime enthusiast, I've seen plenty of shows that focus on the criminals and their psychology, but this show shifted the attention to the people associated with the criminals and how it affected them. Each episode features the story of parents, siblings, extended family members, partners, and even offspring, all people who shared a home or a life with a loved one who would later become a killer. Through a blend of sit-down interviews, dramatic reenactments, old photos, and footage, viewers come to understand how sometimes it's easy to miss signs of danger or warning when it's coming from a person you love. On April 10th, 2022, 22 years after the murder, Evil Lives Here ended its 11th season with an episode titled Divorce? Never. Murder? Maybe. It featured Vernon telling his side of the story of living with and then leaving a woman who would later murder his girlfriend. At this point, Vernon is a 51-year-old man who has lived with guilt and shame for the last 23 years. Things have been said over the years, different things, so I just wanted people to finally understand what happened and how things went down, Vernon said in an interview. I think it drives home the idea that although Vicky showed plenty of signs that she could cause harm, Vernon never believed she would be driven to kill someone. The documentary, alongside other social media posts covering Diane's murder, re-sparked the public's interest in the case in the 2020s. An online obituary featuring a memorial for Diane started getting more traffic as people donated to her page, as recent as May of 2022, likely after learning about it from the true crime documentary series. And people wanted to know what happened to the 3-year-old daughter who had to witness the murder. The trauma Jade went through at such a young age is impossible to imagine. In the episode, Jade actually appeared as a 23-year-old. The producers had contacted her asking if she'd be willing to participate in some of the filmmaking and reconnect with Vernon, whom she hadn't had contact with since the murder. She agreed. Towards the end of the episode, a present-day video of her appeared. She wanted to ask Vernon questions she had about the case and his presence in her life that she'd been sitting with for 20 years. When the film crew set a laptop in front of Vernon and began playing the video of grown-up Jade, tears immediately flooded Vernon's eyes. She looked so much like her mother, he wept. He had to take a moment and step out of the interview to collect himself. When he had calmed down, he watched the video. In it, Jade asked him questions like, if Vernon knew how dangerous Vicky was, why hadn't he taken greater measures to protect her mom and her? She also wanted to know why, after the murder, he seemingly disappeared from her life. That hurt the most, she said in the video. As Vernon looked into the camera to address Jade's questions, he seemed overcome with guilt, and there were many times when he had to stop the interview and collect himself. He explained that the reason he disappeared from her life was that he was afraid he'd only serve as a reminder of the tragic event that happened to her. He feared all Jade would do is blame him. On one hand, I sympathize with Vernon. He feels like the death of Jade's mom is all his fault, and the last thing he wants to do is cause more harm to this little girl's life. On the other hand, did he really have to completely disappear from her life? I know she was only 3, but couldn't he have tried to contact her when she was older? It also sounds like she even tried to contact him, and either he didn't get the messages at all or he ignored them. Since the episode aired, Vernon and Jade reconnected, and sources report that they continue to keep in contact. The story of Alita Diane Ray's murder continued on a sister TV series called Evil Lives Here, Shadows of Death, which premiered on the exact same day, April 10th, 2023. It opened up its 3rd season with an episode called They Killed My Mom that highlighted Jade's experience. The episode also had exclusive interviews with Diane's adopted sister, Esther, and the detective assigned to the case at the time, Curtis Gambrell. Together, they all told an account that gave more insight into Diane's side of the story and her relationship with Vernon. The episode showed that this crime affected many people's lives, but even people as close to the murder victim as Jade, a direct descendant of Diane, felt she didn't get a say in how the perpetrator was dealt with in the courts. Jade said that because she was so young, despite being a key witness to the murder, her testimony wasn't as strong. This case brought to light an issue many victims and/or survivors of crimes suffer in the legal proceedings of a felony: the problem of not feeling like they have a voice. That's one of the reasons Jade went on to support Marsy's Law. Marsy's Law protects a crime victim's rights and revokes certain rights of those accused of crimes to defend themselves. It was enacted February 4th, 2008, and was spearheaded by the family of Marsy Nicholas, a woman who was murdered by her ex-boyfriend. The family worked to pass the law after they went through court proceedings against Marsy's murderer themselves and felt like they were ill-informed by courts and law enforcement to make satisfactory legal decisions against the killer. They believed that while those accused of crimes had several rights in the U.S. Constitution, they, as surviving family members of murder victims, had none. In an editorial published by the Idaho Press on October 23, 2018, Jade explained that she felt Marsy's Law protected the voiceless. Not only her voice when she was going through the court proceedings, but also her mother's, which was taken away from her. I want to share this story to honor my mother, Alita Diane Ray, and the many others whose lives are cut short. They no longer have a voice. In 2010, the case was revisited by the Idaho Court of Appeals when a lower court ordered Vicky to pay $22,500 in restitution back in 2007, more than 6 years after she'd been sentenced. Why did it take so long to file for restitution? Prosecutors claim the case fell through the cracks of the system after the sentencing. The Idaho Court of Appeals denied this motion, which would have had Vicky pay for Diane's funeral and for child benefits, claiming that the order came too late to meet legal standards. It's situations like these that can make people feel like the judicial system protects the culprits more than the victims. Thus, Marsy's Law is an attempt to address that. What do you all think? Should Vicky have been financially responsible for paying for her victim's funeral and for child benefits, even though it had been over 6 years since she was tried? Is Vernon solely responsible for what happened to Diane? Was there more he could have done that would have prevented her murder? Or was it all his fault? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. I'm Lucy, and thanks for tuning in to another episode of Killer Bites.